Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Taste of Home Part 3, Dining Out in Japanese America, presented by the Japanese American National Museum with support from the Consulate General of Japan in Los Angeles. I want to thank you for taking time in your afternoon to join us for this program today. My name is Joy Yamaguchi. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator for the Japanese American National Museum, and I'm so excited that you decided to join us for this discussion of Japanese American food and dining. As I mentioned, a special thanks to the Consulate General of Japan in Los Angeles for their support of this program and this entire program series. We're really thankful to have their support and to be able to put on these exciting conversations all around the relationships between Japan and the US and the food that is involved in those relationships. You can find parts 1 and part 2 of this series on our YouTube channel here where you're watching this recording. And we just are really excited to continue the conversation today with a really wonderful group of speakers. I also wanted to note that the book we mentioned in the program today, Bill's Quiet Revolution, is available now in the JANM store. So you can find that link in the description of this video. And so now I want to introduce our first speaker. Professor Samuel Yamashita is the Henry E. Sheffield Professor of History at Pomona College and the author of Hawaii Regional Cuisine, the Food Movement That Changed the Way Hawaii Eats, and his article entitled The Japanese Turn in Fine Dining in the United States, 1980 to 2020, appeared in Gastronomica in summer 2020. He is currently writing both a history of Japanese food from prehistory to the present, and a history of Pacific Rim fusion cuisine. And you can see some of his work on the screen now. And with that, I would like to welcome Professor Yamashita to this program.
Okay. Well, thank you, Joy, for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this program. Today, I have the special honor of leading off and moderating our discussion. And here's what I'd like to do to prepare the way for our panelists, Joanne Maehara, Akira Hirose, Niki Nakayama, and Sam Nakahira. I'd like to begin by saying just a little about the history of Japanese restaurants in Los Angeles. Then I'd like to describe two important developments that took place in LA after 1980. And the first of these is the opening of Nobu Matsuhisa's iconic restaurant Matsuhisa, and the second is the advent of Euro-Asian cuisine and the resulting Japanese turn in fine dining in Los Angeles. And I was asked to speak for 15 minutes, so I will be brief. So what is the history of Japanese restaurants in Los Angeles? Well, Japanese restaurants have existed in LA since 1893, when Maehara opened on New High Street in Chinatown. It was the first of several Japanese restaurants that opened in Chinatown. The first Japanese restaurants in Little Tokyo opened in the early 1900s. In 1903, a temparaya opened in Little Tokyo, a sobaya opened in 1905, and a sushiya, the first in LA, opened in 1906. And the small number of Japanese restaurants in LA also reflected the fact that the Japanese population of LA in 1900 was only about 200. In 1909, there were 40 Japanese restaurants in Los Angeles, and this reflected the growth in the Japanese population, which would reach 4,800 in 1910. Not surprisingly, the first restaurants that Japanese opened in LA served Western cuisine, which they learned how to make at restaurants and bars where they worked or when they worked as houseboys. Japanese also then opened Chinese restaurants like this one, Cherry Blossom Restaurant in Grand Central Market. And if you notice the menu above the waitresses in this photograph, at the far right, you could order rib steak, ham and eggs, bacon and eggs any style. And then as you moved left, you could order 4 types of noodles, 4 types of egg fooyoung, 4 types of fried rice, 4 types of chow mein, and 8 types of chop suey. And these restaurants were actually called chop suey restaurants. Japanese-owned restaurants serving Japanese food were actually the last to develop. In 1940, there were some 56 Japanese-owned restaurants in Los Angeles serving Japanese food. 31 of them were located in Little Tokyo, and they served a primarily Japanese clientele. The incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II decimated the Japanese restaurant scene, not only in Los Angeles, but all along the West Coast. This is a photograph of the Nisei Grill in San Francisco. And notice the sign that reads, "This restaurant under new management will open soon." And to the right of that sign in Japanese is something that reads, Nisei Western Cuisine Restaurant. In 1948 and 49, there were 16 Japanese-owned Japanese restaurants in Los Angeles, down from 56 in 1940. And from 1949 to 1980, the number of Japanese-owned restaurants jumped to 430. Not all of these served Japanese cuisine. And in 1980, there were 107 Japanese restaurants in Los Angeles. Let me note some of the highlights of the Japanese restaurant scene in Little Tokyo. In 1966, Kawafuku Restaurant had the first sushi bar. Tokyo Kaikan also served sushi, and Ichiro Mashita, a chef there, invented the California roll in the 1970s. The Horikawa Restaurant opened in 1971. The Hotel New Otani opened in 1977, and as many of you will remember, it housed a really fine Japanese restaurant called 1,000 Cranes, which looked out on a Japanese garden and had a tempura bar. Sushi Gen opened in 1980, and Hamasushi opened in 1981. Beginning in the 1970s, Japanese restaurants began to open outside Little Tokyo, in Gardena and the Sawtelle area in Hollywood, Monterey Park, Orange County, and Ventura. And although the owners of many of these new Japanese restaurants were Japanese Americans or Japanese nationals, some of these new Japanese restaurants had Caucasian owners. And given the expansion of the ownership of Japanese restaurants, the clientele of these restaurants also became more diverse and included not only Japanese Americans and Japanese nationals, but also Caucasians and Asian Americans and others as well. I'd like to describe the two other developments that took place in the Japanese restaurant world in LA after 1980. The first of these was the opening of Matsuhisa in Beverly Hills in 1987. And one might ask, why was Matsuhisa so important? Well, in the first place, Nobu Matsuhisa was trained in Tokyo in the 1960s, worked in Peru for a time, and then brought a new type of Japanese cuisine to Los Angeles, what food scholar Shoko Imai calls Nobu-style Japanese cuisine. In the second place, Matsuhisa also raised the price point of Japanese cuisine in Los Angeles. And in the third place, Matsuhisa spawned a slew of first-rate Japanese restaurants, as many of those who worked at Matsuhisa went on to open their own restaurants. I'm thinking of Takao, I'm thinking of Asanebo and Shunji, for example. This is what I would call the Matsuhisa effect. And here I also should mention Masa Takayama and his career in Los Angeles. Takayama opened Sabaya in a strip mall in 1980. Then he opened Ginza Sushiko in 1987. And then in 1992, he moved Ginza Sushiko to Beverly Hills. And then in 2004, Takayama moved to New York, where he opened a restaurant called Masa. I think Takayama and to some extent Matsuhisa helped foster an image of Japanese cuisine as a luxurious haute cuisine. In the first place, Takayama's restaurants have been super expensive. In 1990, the average bill for food at Ginza Sushiko was $125 to $150 per person, and it became the most expensive restaurant in LA. Second, Takayama's restaurants were only omakase. Customers did not order. The chef decided what you got. And Ginza Sushiko was distinctive in a third way. Takayama kept track of when customers ate at his restaurant, how many were in their party, what they ate, and what they drank. So the next time they came, he could be sure to offer them something different. And this is typical of the best restaurants in Japan. Matsuhisa and Takayama also paved the way for the first kaiseki restaurants in the US. Niki Nakayama opened Naka in Los Angeles in 2008. Brushstroke opened in New York City in 2011, closed in 2018. And Nanzan Giro Giro opened in Honolulu in 2011. Matsuhisa and Takayama together had one other effect. They also paved the way for top Japanese chefs and restaurants to open branches overseas. For example, top Japanese sushi masters set up shop in LA. Hiroyuki Naruke, for example, had a sushi shop in Roppongi in Tokyo. He closed it and moved to open Q on 7th Street in Los Angeles in 2013. Sushi Ginza Onodera from Tokyo opened a branch on La Cienega and West Hollywood in 2016. And Tempura Endo from Kyoto, a tempura restaurant founded in 1885, opened a branch in Beverly Hills in 2016. And clearly, this is what might be called the globalization of Japanese haute cuisine. Now, the second important development that took place in the Japanese restaurant world in Los Angeles after 1980 was one that has gone largely under the radar, although I think many of us noticed one of its manifestations, what I would call the big plate, small portion phenomenon. We didn't understand what was happening. And what was happening was that a new Euro-Asian cuisine emerged in LA between 1979 and 1984. Roy Yamaguchi may have been the first chef to offer this new cuisine at Le Gourmet, a French restaurant in Los Angeles, and he called it Euro-Asian cuisine. Wolfgang Puck opened Spago in 1982 and Chinois en Main in 1983, and at the latter, he offered his version of Euro-Asian cuisine. The Chaya restaurants opened in the early 1980s and offered their take on Euro-Asian cuisine. La Petite Chaya in 1981 with Kihachi Kumagai at the helm, and Chaya Brasserie in 1984 with Shigefumi Tachibe running the kitchen. And Roy Yamaguchi opened 385 North in West Hollywood in 1984. Now, Euro-Asian cuisine is important for this discussion because it led to what I call the Japanese turn in fine dining in Los Angeles. And what I mean by the Japanese turn is the increasing use of Japanese ingredients, condiments, culinary techniques, and culinary concepts at fine dining establishments in LA. And driving the Japanese turn in Los Angeles was a platoon of Japanese cooks who had been trained at Spago and Chinois en Main and other LA French restaurants, who opened their own restaurants between 1986 and 2004. Hideo Yamashita opened Shiro Restaurant in Pasadena in 1986. Kazuto Matsuzaka opened Zen Zero in Santa Monica in 1992. and Beacon in 2004. And Fred Iwasaki opened Carrots on a strip mall on Santa Monica Boulevard in 1991. And these chefs, offered as Yamaguchi and the Chaya chefs, did what became a new Euro-Japanese cuisine. By the 2010s, Japanese ingredients, condiments, culinary techniques, and concepts are common knowledge in the restaurant world in Los Angeles. Maiko Cimarusti at Providence is a good example. Cimarusti's tasting menu has opened with sashimi since 2011. Joseph Centeno at Orson Winston on 7th Street in downtown LA uses a wide array of Japanese ingredients and condiments. He also adopted the omakase format for his menus. This is an Orson Winston menu from February 2016, and I've highlighted in bold the Japanese ingredients on the menu: kimedai, which is golden eye snapper, uni, shiso, Asian pear, wagyu ribeye, and miso. There's also a Japanese dish, chawanmushi, on the menu. And Centeno also serves okayu using a premium Japanese rice, satsuki rice, which he pairs with uni or scallops. And Carlos Salgado, a fine Mexican-American chef and one of the leaders of the Alta California movement at his restaurant Taco Maria in Costa Mesa, also uses Japanese condiments such as miso and white soy sauce, and he adds dashi to add umami to his dishes. And in Salgado's case, it's not obvious, and it wasn't obvious to me until I interviewed him in 2019. So what to say in conclusion? Well, in the first place, Japanese restaurants have a long history in LA that began in 1893. Japanese restaurants first appeared in Chinatown, then developed in Little Tokyo, and expanded to West LA, Orange County, Ventura, and the Inland Empire. And this expansion reflected the growing demand for Japanese cuisine outside Little Tokyo. Nobu Matsuhisa and Masa Takayama fostered an image of Japanese cuisine as a luxurious haute cuisine from 1987 to the present. And this helped elevate Japanese cuisine from being an ethnic cuisine to a new, quote, foreign cuisine, as NYU food scholar Krishnendu Ray points out. And in the fourth place, well-established chefs and famous restaurants in Japan opened branches in Europe, US, and China from the 1990s. And finally, the basic elements of Japanese cuisine are now familiar to chefs at fine dining establishments in the US. So all the panelists, please start your videos. Good. Okay. Joanne Maehara Hirose is a dental hygienist who has worked in Little Tokyo for decades. She was working at lingerie in Hollywood when she met her husband, Akira, and lived in Kyoto for 7 years while he ran a French restaurant there. Akira Hirose was born and raised in Kyoto and studied French cuisine in France with some of the great modern French chefs, including Joel Robuchon, as I recall. And his first restaurant, Azay Le Rideau, I'm probably butchering the French, I apologize for that. Azay Le Rideau was a French restaurant located in Kyoto. He then opened a second French restaurant that many of you know, Maison Akira in Pasadena, and he now owns Azay on First Street in Little Tokyo. Niki Nakayama, I believe, is a native Angelino. Yes, native Angelino, who has been part of the LA restaurant scene for several decades. She is chef and co-owner of Naka and was featured in the first episode of the first season of Chef's Table, which many of you may have seen. And last but not least, Sam Nakahira is a Grinnell College alumna and an MFA student at the Center for Cartoon Studies in White River Junction, Vermont. I'm sure you're missing Los Angeles weather. And she is the author of a graphic novel about the Japanese-American food retailer Bill Fujimoto, who had a huge role in the history of California cuisine and the local farm-to-table movements. Well, let me start the questions, and I'll direct them to the panelists in the order that I introduce them. So I'd like to start with Joanne Maehara Hirose, and you'll have to unmute your microphone. Okay. Joanne, what do you remember about Japanese restaurants in Little Tokyo when you were growing up?
Well, when we used to go out to eat in Little Tokyo, I remember the restaurants were very cozy. The ambience was very nice with booths. Some had booths, some had table, jukeboxes, some had counters, and it was very warm and cozy. The food was very flavorful, very consistent, a lot of comfort food. And those were the type of restaurants that our family went to as I was growing up.
Uh-huh. How did they change over time?
Well, either, they were mom and pop owned after the war and until the 70s. And then either the chef would pass away or retire and they would sell to a new owner. It wouldn't, not too many continued on. The only ones I can remember passing it down through the generations is Mitsuru Grill and Cafe and Tokyo Gardens. And that has continued on till now, those two restaurants. But the rest, either sold and then new restaurants would come up and then corporate would, buy the restaurants, change names.
I used to go to Sushi Imai on First Street. And I was terrified of Imai-san. But we got to be friends, and he became very kind after a while. But it was 本当に怖かったね、最初. Okay. Akira, I'd like to ask you, you know that I've talked about this phenomenon called the Japanese turn in fine dining in the US. Were you aware of this? Was this something that you were noticing as well?
Oh, more Japanese. Well, I grew up with French cuisine, so my style becoming the French with a Japanese twist. So, but I see some Japanese chef, other way, Japanese chef doing the Japanese cuisine with a little in the French style.
Oh, interesting.
So sometimes I go to the restaurant and then looking the dishes, I can tell, oh, this chef grew up French and then doing Japanese now. Because I used to do the French.
Now, when you added Japanese elements to your dishes, what kinds of things did you do?
Very, very beginning, I start using shoyu. Just for the inside, a little bit to dressing and shoyu. So I remember the French, we have the shrimp called a langoustine. It's a shrimp. So we salted with the dog fat, the shrimp, and the last minute we added a little bit to shoyu flavor vinaigrette to finish, and then we plated with this shrimp and then salad mixed with the juice stay in the pan. That's how I started the shoyu.
Interesting. I think you told me once that you saw Joel Robuchon adding shoyu to the dressing for a langoustine appetizer.
Yes, that was, I was working in the Nico de Paris in 1979. And then he was chef director of the celebrity Nikko Hotel. So inside the Nikko Hotel, there's a Japanese restaurant called Benkei. So they do the old Japanese restaurant, the Japanese cuisine. So Chef Robuchon used to go always to see what's going on in the Japanese, the kitchen upstairs. And then he was asking, what is this? Well, how do you use it? Why you do this? Well, he was asking so much questions to the Japanese chef. So he brought little by little Japanese flavor and ingredient to French cuisine. And now so many the French chef using the Japanese ingredient.
Did you start to use dashi at Maison Akira at any point?
No, dashi, not the dashi at the Maison Akira.
Okay. Because that surprised me that some American chefs, David Kinch, for example, at his restaurant, I forgot the name of it, in Los Gatos, he uses Manresa. Yeah, he uses a lot of dashi in his cooking, and he even makes the dashi with 4 different kinds of kombu and katsuobushi. Yeah, I was quite surprised at how elevated his knowledge of Japanese cuisine is. Well, thank you. Niki, I would like to ask you about your training as a chef and to ask you to talk about the things that most influenced you and that helped to shape the cuisine, the food that you make today.
Well, I originally started in culinary at the Southern California School of Culinary Arts in Pasadena. So my first real formal training of cooking was European-based. And although I had a little experience when I was in Japan working at the relatives' ryokan's kitchen, the actual training came after culinary school. And I remember during culinary school, I really enjoyed European cooking and French style dishes. And I always imagined that was probably the way or the road that I would take. But luckily, during the time that I was at culinary school, I started working at Takao Restaurant. And I remember before that, I was doing a little bit of an internship or externship at an Italian restaurant. And I remember walking to the Italian restaurant every day and just sort of immersed in the smell of cheese and everything that was, Italian. But walking into Takao Restaurant, I remember thinking, oh my God, it's dashi. The smell of dashi is so wonderful. And I knew right then and there that I wanted to follow the Japanese cooking, that Japanese cooking was for me, because just the smell of dashi was so heartwarming and so comforting and so familiar. And it seemed like the perfect answer to everything.
Interesting. I had no idea that you had training in Western cuisine. I should have known that, but this is the first time I've heard that. Were you aware of what I call the Matsuhisa effect?
Yes. I think that was such a very big effect during the time that I was in culinary school, because it felt like a lot of Japanese restaurants were just about changing and turning and being influenced by the things that Matsuhisa was doing. And specifically, even with Takao-san, who worked with Matsuhisa-san for over 10 years, I saw it all throughout his menu. He had things that were European influence. He had things that you wouldn't normally see on Japanese, at Japanese restaurants. He was using caviar, he was using foie gras, he was using things that were just not traditionally Japanese and incorporating Japanese flavors to them. And I thought that it was really a genius type of merging. And especially because, in Japanese cooking, for example, Matsuhisa, he really introduced things that were Peruvian flavor profile-wise, like cilantro and different types of peppers and spices. And in Japanese cooking, you would never see cilantro, because cilantro before Matsuhisa was it wasn't enjoyed in Japan. It was just something that was sort of found in different types of Southeast Asian cuisines. But after Matsuhisa came along and he, paired the sashimi and cilantro together, it seemed that that was a whole new awakening for a lot of Japanese chefs.
When did you decide that you wanted to do kaiseki?
I decided that I wanted to do kaiseki after an extraordinary meal that I had in Japan that was kaiseki. It was the experience of eating the whole kaiseki meal that was completely different from any meal I had experienced prior to that in terms of Japanese food, because there were so many little elements that you could enjoy. And I like cooking and food because I always imagine it as something that brings people joy. And sitting down at that meal, I felt like I was opening gifts and Christmas gifts, like on Christmas Day, like multiple dishes with different vessels and all these different preparations. And it was just a really amazing experience. And I thought, this is what I want to do someday.
Interesting. And Akira, you're from Kyoto, which is sort of the home of kaiseki.
Mm-hmm.
Were you not influenced by kaiseki at all?
No, Maison Akira Pasadena, I used to have a chef omakase menu, which is like a kind of kaiseki, like 8 or 10 or even 12 courses. And then what was one of the menu? And then in the portion becoming smaller, each dishes, and then each dish is a different way to cook. And so it was very enjoyable to do myself, and also the customer. They want to try a lot of things, and then but now at the Azay Restaurant in Little Tokyo, we are very small restaurant, so I don't do kaiseki, chef omakase, but occasionally I have a mind to do in the future.
Well, we'll look forward to that. And both you and Niki are making obento.
Yeah.
How has that been going, Niki? How have you found obento?
Well, I mean, with obento, originally it was kind of just a matter of circumstance with COVID. And when we first announced that we would do obento, it was more of the desire to survive this whole situation. And I think as we've researched more and more about bento and learned more about bento, I'm finding it to be very challenging in fun ways as well as challenging in difficult ways, because unlike food that you get to eat right away, we always have to think about in terms of temperature or how to hold dishes. And I noticed that even with the seasoning aspects of bento, they tend to be a little bit stronger than what we would generally season at our restaurant, because the flavor and profile changes a bit as it travels. So for us, it's been a very wonderful learning experience. It's been also a very challenging one, but I think overall we're having fun doing it.
I think we all know that the Japanese have a great tradition of portable food, which is what bento is. But I was surprised to learn that obento started in the 700s with a kind of dried rice. The rice would be cooked and then dried and then given to workers. And at lunchtime or mealtime, they would rehydrate the rice if there was time, or if there wasn't time, they would simply eat the dried rice. And I have to say, I was surprised. I hadn't realized that obento had kind of working class food roots, which I found really interesting. And of course, it changes over time. But I'm also noticing that in LA, Korean bento has become popular, and I'm looking forward to Mexican bento.
That sounds fun.
I'm sure there'll be Mexican bento bako. Sam Nakahira, please tell us who Bill Fujimoto was and why you decided to write about him.
So Bill Fujimoto was a Japanese-American food retailer from Berkeley, California. And he ran Monterey Market from like the 1970s to around early 2000s. And Monterey Market was like an all produce market. And Bill sourced produce and like fruits and vegetables only from like small family farmers, most of them in the Bay Area, but a lot of them from different parts of California. But usually they were like more local. And Bill Fujimoto, he had like a really big influence on California cuisine and farm to table movements, especially in the 1970s, which were just like these movements were kind of starting to come about then. In Berkeley, California, I think it was a really big like kind of spot for these food movements because there was a lot of chefs like Alice Waters and Jeremiah Towers who were kind of like committed to like French cuisine, being inspired by local movements and just like in France where the cuisine kind of focused on the ingredients and freshness and also seasonality, somewhat similar to kaiseki. I think Bill Fujimoto, he wasn't a chef, but he also had like very similar values in kind of valuing seasonality and taste of his produce. I think he kind of, I remember he was explaining to me during our interviews, oral history interviews, that he could taste like when a certain produce was in season or not, and if it was like grown too immature or like too old and things like that. And so I think a lot of chefs in the Bay Area came to Bill's market because they knew the produce there was like the freshest and the best tasting. And also because Bill like sourced from local farmers, which was what they were kind of looking for. And Alice Waters, she describes Bill as like her all question man. Like whenever she needed like a specific ingredient or produce, she would go to him to like ask where he could like find a certain farmer in the Bay Area or like local. And so I think Bill was really good at supporting small local farmers, especially because a lot of them had a hard time getting their produce to sell in like chain supermarkets. But for Bill, like he kind of created Monterey Market as a community where I guess like small farmers could kind of connect with local consumers and also chefs. But I think, though, it's really interesting that he knew so many people involved in California cuisine movement who were like all kind of credited for like this historical, food movement, but he doesn't really get a lot of credit for his role. So I think that's kind of why I wanted to create this comic about him. And yeah, I think the comic was also based on my historical research in undergrad, where I did a lot of oral history interviews with Bill and some other Japanese farmers in California. And when trying to kind of write my academic paper about this history, it just felt like pretty dry. And I kind of thought a comic would communicate like the humanity of the people better that I interviewed.
Uh-huh. Were many of the farmers who contributed to California cuisine, were many Nikkei farmers who had been farming for decades?
So I think there was a few, but I'm not too certain about like the names of people. But I think in general, he was kind of just helping small family farmers, like regardless of race, just ones who were in the local area. I think a lot of them are still sourcing to the restaurants like Japanese and others.
I think California cuisine was very important for the Japanese turn. And I think maybe Niki, very, very important for the kinds of things that you do as well. I think both you and Akira probably benefited from California cuisine and the locavoric food movement that it promoted.
Yes, for us, it's a very important backdrop to what kaiseki is about. I think when we first originally thought about when I was first thinking of doing kaiseki in Los Angeles, there was this desire to bring food from Japan to sort of really highlight what kaiseki tradition is. But then over time, I think we started to question that decision because when you really think about what kaiseki philosophy is, it's about showcasing the area that you're close to and the things that are near you and really highlighting what that the area is about. And then it became apparent that we really needed to incorporate California into the kaiseki style that we were doing so that it was a more clear voice of what kaiseki philosophy is.
Interesting. Akira, you benefited from the California cuisine movement, I bet. And you probably had vegetables and fruits in California that you couldn't get in Kyoto?
Looking the California vegetable, I will say like over 30 years, it changes a lot of change. First, I find out the looks good, color is good, but was flavorless. But now, you know, a lot of vegetable becoming looks good and there also a lot of flavor. So because I think the chef want to have a more flavor, fresh vegetable, that's why they work together with the farmer, and the farmer tries to get a more better, you know, they study too. And I think farmers and then chefs need to study each other.
Interesting, interesting. Well, I want to ask you all a question that brings us back to the taste of home theme. And I wanted to ask each of you, what Japanese dish from your childhood do you most remember and why? What dish from your childhood? Why don't we start? Joanne, why don't you start? What dish, Japanese dish from your childhood do you most remember and why do you remember it so well?
I would say sukiyaki because that was always such a treat. When my mom would make it, it was always for a special occasion like a birthday or, you know, if we were celebrating something at home. And I came from a family of 6. So it was a special treat to be able to get a lot of sukiyaki made and make, you know, a one-pot thing for all of us. So I remember that the most. And my mom's flavoring, how she was a pretty good cook. So,
what part of Japan was your mother from?
She was from Okayama, which is the continent. Yeah. So she flavored her food a lot, and she did a lot of home cooking for us. So we are very fortunate.
Like, you know, when you were growing up, what dish do you remember from your childhood?
You know, first thing that I remember when I had to talk about when I was a kid. You might gonna laugh. Tamago gohan, which is raw eggs, shoyu, and the white rice. I remember when, you know, like junior high school in the morning. I wake up late, and I don't have no time to, you know, having the breakfast. This is the best meal and very quick, and then make, eat, and go. Yeah. So I still eat sometime.
Yeah, me too. I think it's a boys' dish, actually.
Yeah, boys' dish. Yeah, that's right. But also, my mother is from Aichi Prefecture. So Aichi Prefecture is mostly the miso, the dark red miso flavor. So she used to make always even nikomi, the braised vegetable or chikwa, like a kind of oden, but you always using the dark red miso. So I was born in Kyoto, but my miso shiru, our family miso shiru was always red miso. So always I like a red miso.
Interesting. Niki, when you were growing up, what dish was the most memorable?
I think the most impactful one, because I feel like when we talk about Japanese food, I love every single thing that I've eaten, have eaten. But I think the most impactful one was the first experience of real sushi. I remember my parents taking me to a sushi bar where Virgil and First or Second Street was, and it was like right at the corner. And I remember thinking, I don't think I can eat all these uncooked fish because it was just, I didn't grow up wanting to eat fish a lot, but because we had fish at home all the time. But I remember I was being bribed to eat it because there was something I wanted, and my parents were like, if you eat this meal, then maybe we'll think about buying it for you. And I remember halfway through the meal eating all the sushi and thinking, oh my God, I think I'm winning here because this is the best thing I've ever had, but I have to just pretend that I'm not enjoying it. But it was so like impactful and so delicious. And the combination of sushi and green tea together was just like one of the most amazing experiences that I've ever had. And I would say sushi is still my favorite food today.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
What dish do you remember from Japanese from your childhood?
Actually, it's also sukiyaki. I think I think it's a good like family dish. Something about like having a hot pot and just like kind of communally taking from it was always fun for me. And I think I have two younger sisters, so it was like we would fight over which pieces of like meat to eat,
Oh,
like mushrooms and stuff.
interesting. What part of Japan was your mother from?
So I'm actually like fifth generation Japanese, so we like don't know too much about like where our family was located in Japan.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, should probably look into it though.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Well, let me ask you one other big question, and then we will turn the floor over to Kristen. What is your favorite dining out Japanese dish? And Nikki, you've said sushi, so maybe you'll have to pick another one. But what was your favorite dining out Japanese dish? Why don't I go back to Joanne and start with Joanne?
Yes. Wow, that's hard. I guess I would say okonomiyaki. I like okonomiyaki. I could make it at home, but I think it's harder to make it the Hiroshima style where my dad is from, because you have to make that thin omelet and you gotta flip it with the noodles. And I can make the Osaka style because I learned when I was living in Kyoto, but that's easier. But yeah, I like to go out to eat that.
Okonomiyaki. Akira, what is your favorite dining out dish?
Yeah, mostly when I go to eat out lunchtime, mostly I ask zaru soba, cold soba.
Oh, really?
And if they know how to make a good tempura, I would ask the tenzaru, meaning the tempura zaru soba.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. Kyoto is not famous for its osoba.
It's people think, but we just had the soba from Owariya from Kyoto.
Yeah, I know Owariya.
Owariya.
Yeah.
It's an over 400 years restaurant.
Owariya dates from the late.
Yeah, Owariya they started like the soba cookie, but they became to a soba noodle restaurant.
Yeah.
So very nice. We had
right.
For the toshikoshi soba, and very thin, and then very good. I can eat it every day.
You had it for toshikoshi soba? Oh, I'm jealous. That's really wonderful.
But soba, Kyoto people say most important to the soba is that the tsuyu.
Oh.
Soba important, but more important is the tsuyu.
But the tsuyu in Kyoto is very, very light, isn't it?
Yes. So I can finish. When I finish a tsuyu, every tsuyu, this is a good dish for me.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
Tokyo is more darker. You cannot even see the bottom of the bowl.
Yeah. Shoyu karai. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nikki, what is your favorite dining out dish besides osushi?
I think now my favorite dining out dish has to be any type of yakitori. Any type of yakitori, kushiyaki, any kind of binchotan grilled flavored things.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. I never would have guessed that. Interesting. Sam, what is your favorite dining out Japanese dish?
I think it have to be katsu. I think I just really like fried things, and something about eating it like at a restaurant just tastes better than like making it at home.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. Katsu, yeah. Interesting. Interesting. Well, we probably should give Kristen some time to introduce valuable items from the collection. Kristen, shall I introduce you at this point? Okay. Dr. Kristen Hayashi did her graduate work in U.S. history at the University of California, Riverside, and is the director of collections access and Management at the Japanese American National Museum. And she's given us fabulous artifacts in the program so far. So I'm looking forward to what she'll show us today. Kristen, please.
Hey, greetings, everyone. This has been such a fun conversation to take part in. So as Sam said, I'm going to just share a sampling from JANM's collection. And Sam provided a really great overview, I think, of the history. So hopefully my presentation will complement some of the history that he shared. Okay. So, as we're doing research for this program, there were just so many really neat artifacts and ephemera and photographs on this topic. And so in order to include as many as we could, my colleague in collections, Sean Iwaoka, created this video to try to show you the geographic diversity of Japanese-owned restaurants throughout the country over time and that are represented in JANM's collection. So from the results of our search through the collection, I think the earliest photograph that we found of a Japanese operated restaurant was from 1912, although it wasn't identified in terms of which restaurant or what location. And then in terms of the most contemporary, I think Atomic Cafe was probably the most contemporary. So photographs of the restaurant before its closure in 1989. So we found that Japanese American directories were a really great resource to understand the landscape of restaurants in the United States. And these directories sort of categorize Japanese operated restaurants in three different ways: through American style cuisine, chop suey or Chinese influenced cuisine, and then also Japanese style restaurants. So I'm going to sort of use that framework to sort of talk about a few samples from our collection, and then I'm going to focus on three specific restaurants. So you've seen a little bit of the diversity. We started in Little Tokyo, and then we sort of looked at Greater Los Angeles and then Southern California, as you can see here with Gardena. And then we're going to take you to San Francisco, and also to Portland and Seattle, Kona, and then finally New York. So you can see from the different ephemera and photographs that sometimes these restaurants were catering to more of a Japanese clientele, sometimes to a non-Japanese clientele, and sort of just depended on the type of cuisine that each restaurant was serving. And let's see, here's a good example. So this is Busch Garden Restaurant in Seattle, and you can see from their menu, this is catering to a non-Japanese clientele, and you see that because they have instructions on how to use chopsticks, in addition to telling you about the offerings at the restaurant. Here's a menu. So while it has a Japanese name, Gyokoken Cafe, the offerings here are it's Chinese food, which I think is interesting. Restaurant here from Kona. And then finally, this is the Miyako Restaurant in New York. And we found this postcard in our collection from the Miyako, here it is, in New York. And I found the message on the back to be so poignant. So this is a postcard from Kay and George to their folks. And they said, visited New York and ate at the Miyako, having a swell time. And then you look over and you see that their parents, Mr. and Mrs. M. Ohashi, received this postcard while they were incarcerated at Manzanar during World War II. And I think, you realize the luxury of being able to dine in a Japanese restaurant in New York in 1943. So that was like our tour through Japanese restaurants. And so now I'll just sort of talk about like these different types. So here's an example from our collection that shows a Japanese operated restaurant that served an American style menu. So you can see here, we've highlighted a few of the offerings here. So corned beef and cabbage, beef hash and gravy, fried clams, mutton and dressing. And I loved that at the bottom in big letters, it said big bowl rice, 5 cents. So if you grew up eating white rice with everything, you would understand that white rice makes the perfect complement, I think, to every single item. And so this is the Wada family's restaurant in Portland. We don't know the name of the restaurant, but this is circa 1917. And here's an example of a Chinese style restaurant. This is Sankolo, which many of you probably remember dining at some point. So Chinese style restaurant that was based in Little Tokyo. And so like other Chinese restaurants in Little Tokyo, Sankolo offered an Americanized version of Chinese food that was quite popular amongst Japanese Americans. Sankolo also offered a spacious banquet room that allowed for large social gatherings, like this one here. This may have been a wedding or a funeral reception. And then, of course, there were Japanese style restaurants. So this is an example here, again, in Los Angeles' Little Tokyo. This is Monsayon. And it was at 129 South San Pedro Street and opened in the 1920s. And nama soba was one of their specialties. And then after the war, Monsayon reopened, this time as New Monsayon, in the same location. So now I'm going to highlight 3 specific examples of restaurants. All of them were in Los Angeles' Little Tokyo, and they all have a connection to one another, as well as they represent, they have a good representation of artifacts in JANM's collection. So we'll start with Kawafuku, which Sam mentioned. So Takichi and Hanakato opened Kawafuku on Weller Street in 1923, and they later moved the restaurant around the corner to 204 and a half East First Street. So Kawafuku was an upscale restaurant that had tatami rooms, like you can see in the upper left-hand corner, as well as large banquet rooms. And the largest one in the restaurant sat 300 persons. So especially before the war, Kawafuku's specialty was sukiyaki, which has been mentioned several times by our other panelists as being one of their favorites. So Takichi was sort of, I think, unique. He was trained as a chef in Japan before he immigrated to the United States, and he worked in the imperial household's kitchen. And I think he also worked for the imperial family, or worked in France as well, before he came to the United States and opened Kawafuku. And so this is a post-war menu that you see here on the left. And in addition to advertising sukiyaki, now some of their other specialties seem to be tempura and chop suey. And in the spread on the table in the photo on the right, you can see the sukiyaki, even steam coming off from the sukiyaki, as well as tempura. It looks really delicious, I think. So Kawafuku became a hub for the Japanese American community. You know, it was arguably also one of the most well-known Japanese restaurants in Los Angeles at the time. And I think that also attracted non-Japanese diners who were maybe a little bit more adventurous. And so here's a gathering. You can see all of the dishes on the table, and we have some of those dishes in our collection. So you see a sake carafe, and you see several lacquer dishes, including a shallow sake cup, which I believe is called a sakezuki, and some other lacquer bowls and dishes that they served their food in. And we also have knives that are described as sushi knives. So maybe those were used in the sushi bar that Sam mentioned being very unique at Kawafuku. Oops. Here's a business card on the left for Kawafuku, being advertised as a sukiyaki house. And then on the right, this is an ad for Kawafuku from the 1949 Japanese American directory or yearbook. And then I thought this photograph was really interesting. So it was described as being the first post-war meeting of the Little Tokyo Japanese Business Association. So this was 1952. And so I imagine this was a really significant meeting that they held as they were trying to think about, you know, revitalizing Los Angeles' Little Tokyo through the businesses that were established there. So next we'll talk about Daruma Cafe. And so Takichi and Hanakato's son, Mitsuo, also known as Jack, opened his own Japanese restaurant sort of down the street. He called it Daruma Cafe, and it was located at 123 South San Pedro Street. Mitsuo and his wife, Masako, opened Daruma Cafe sometime between 1945 and 1949, because this is an advertisement from 1949 for Daruma Cafe. And here we find Mitsuo Jack Kato, who was a chef at the restaurant. And I think he's on a break in this photograph. And here's another one of the chefs at Daruma plating up one of their dishes. Another photograph of both front of house and back of house staff at Daruma Cafe. And so Masako and Mitsuo are pictured here. Masako is in the front on the right, and Mitsuo stands next to her or behind her. Daruma Cafe served home-style Japanese food. And I know there was a question about how Japanese menus or offerings at these restaurants sort of changed over time. And so it's really interesting to study these menus. So it looks like at Daruma Cafe, a dish called nizakana, cooked or boiled fish, was one of their specialties. And I believe that this photograph is a picture of this dish. So if you recall any of the dishes at any of these restaurants that you just really loved, I invite you to put that in the chat so we can sort of get a discussion going about these specialty dishes. But so Masako and Mitsuo subsequently opened a second Daruma Cafe location in Montebello in 1963. And Montebello is just east of downtown Los Angeles. So this menu comes from their Montebello location. And here's the nizakana dish, I believe. So Haruko Shimoda worked at Daruma Cafe, and this is also where she met her husband, Kaoru Shiba. And they opened Koharu Restaurant at 357 East 1st Street in 1959. So Haruko's bunraku teacher gave her this good luck plaque when the restaurant opened. And so it says Koharu in kanji. And this is a photograph from opening day at Koharu in July 1959. And in 1990, Haruko Shimoda Shiba provided the following context for this photograph. So she says, the picture from this opening shows in the background, from left to right, Haruko, Johnny, Kaoru, who was Haruko's husband, and first waitress. In the foreground at the center, so he's looking at the camera, the man in the short sleeve white shirt, collared shirt, is Mr. Ninomiya. And so he was he had a photography studio just a few doors down. So that's Kinso Ninomiya. And then next to him, she says, unknown person. And then next, she says, the mama-san of Chidori, Anomiya, Kazunaga-san. And then after her, she says, an old man, maybe named Mr. Mori, question mark. In the booths to the right are Nisei Week Queen and Court. Koharu hosted Nisei Week Queen and Court for lunch every year. And here's some artifacts that we have from Koharu. And you could see these same objects on the counter and on the tables at Koharu. And I know these are really mundane artifacts, right? But they really evoke this nostalgia, I think, for Koharu. And I've never, even been there, but I think through Haruko's description and just seeing this photograph and these artifacts, cozy really comes to mind. And that's something that I think Joanne sort of mentioned, her remembering about restaurants in Little Tokyo. And I really get that sense, through these artifacts and through these photographs, which I think is really, really special and neat. So I just want to leave you with a recipe that Haruko shared with us. And this is Haruko's recipe to make Koharu's secret tare, which she suggests can be used as a basic teriyaki sauce for broiled fish, chicken, etc. So this is her recipe. She says, take 1 cup of sake, yaku it, and in parentheses, she says, boil till it burns. Add 1 gallon of Yamasa shoyu. Toss in 1 Karo corn syrup bottle, 12 to 16 ounces, and 1 cup of mirin. 15 scoops of sugar with big spoon, 1 big spoon of garlic powder, 1 big spoon of ajinomoto, and cook for 20 minutes. Then put tare in pan, cook meat in it until it cooks. Cut up and serve. I see Nikki is writing this down. So anyway, just to close, thank you for dining with us from home. And that's just a little sampling of JANM's collection. I just want to thank my colleagues in collections for helping to do all this research, and especially to Sean Iwaoka, who digitized all this and created that video that you saw in the beginning. So we'd love to continue to amass JANM's collection in terms of Japanese food culture. So if you have artifacts that sort of document Japanese restaurants in the United States, and you're interested in adding those to JANM's collection, please let us know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristen, and to all. It was just such a exciting insight into the history, and I'm really excited to kind of dive more into that. We have some questions about that. And so I'm just going to open up the Q&A. We've already gotten a lot of questions for all of you specifically. If you have any more, you can use the Q&A feature, and we'll get to as many as we can. But I think we can put the email for collections and for JANM in the chat if you have more specific questions about the presentation. I would love to kind of start with a question that you hinted at, Kristen, and wondered if other folks also have that, so we can start early. But were there any specific changes to menus and cooking styles in JA restaurants from pre-war to post-war era? Did some foods fall out of popularity? Saying that some Japanese Americans tried to fit in more with American culture after camps, and wondering if this was reflected culinarily. So I don't know if Kristen or Sam have any thoughts on this?
I defer to Kristen.
I mean, so again, I'm not a food historian or a food expert, but just from the limited, menus that we have in our collection, and just from what I see on menus today, I would say that there is a difference. It just seemed like from these menus that were both from pre-war and post-war, and in terms of Japanese foods, it was foods that I wasn't really familiar with. So to me, it seemed like more home style, or foods that you might see more in Japan. So what are some examples? Like things like I saw buta tofu on some of these menus, which I don't really think I've seen on Japanese restaurants today. So those are just some basic observations just from looking at menus in our collection.
Yeah, I saw some of you laughing at the. Were any of the things that Kristen shared something that was familiar to you all, the restaurants, or do you have any stories or observations on what was presented and shared to the rest of the panelists? I'd be curious.
I think from what I saw of the menu, it was really exciting to see that originally pre-war, that a lot of the food was very traditionally Japanese. Like they have, like what Kristen said, like the nizakana, the yakizakana, and then in the Japanese text, there's nabemono. Like back then, people were still eating in the way they were traditionally very Japanese. And I'm so super interested to see what people started to eat after the war. So it's really exciting to learn about this history of Japanese culture and Japanese Americans.
Tokyo Cafe or Tokyo Gardens, it ended up, before they closed and became just cafe on Judge Iso Street, one of the owners did share her buta tofu recipe with me, because they're probably one of the last to serve that dish. But yes, it's very good. I used to make it at home for my dad, but theirs was very good. My dad loved that restaurant.
Interesting.
Yeah, you're lucky you have the behind the scenes recipe that I'm sure everyone is jealous of. Another question kind of to the history of this all. I think this would probably go towards Professor Yamashita, but Kevin asked, has the Japanese turn in fine dining taken place in other countries like Western Europe at the same time as the US? So curious about that. And then another question about this kind of Japanese turn was Allison asked if any of the panelists see a Japanese influence in the physical design of restaurants to parallel the turn in cuisine over the decades, or does the physical design of restaurants follow a different course? And I know that we've mentioned kind of the coziness and the different atmospheres. So
I can say that I was tracking the Japanese turn in Europe beginning, I guess, about 10 or 15 years ago. And it was my impression that they were behind chefs in Los Angeles and New York. And so, for example, at top Michelin-starred restaurants in Holland, for example, chefs would add 1 or 2 pieces of katsuobushi to the top of an appetizer. And I remember thinking, this is very primitive, that they're not even making dashi. They're just adding 1 or 2 pieces of dried bonito flakes. I think the most advanced use of Japanese techniques that I saw was at a restaurant called Alan Williams in London, a single Michelin-starred place. And Chef Williams used kombu to sous vide some sea bass. And so he had a plastic envelope, and he put the piece of bass in, and then a sheet of kombu. And I thought, this is much more advanced than just 1 piece of katsuobushi on the top of the appetizer. I don't know, maybe Chef Akira noticed some things in his travels.
But it's when I'm Japanese, so I'm going to eat some restaurant using the Japanese ingredient. I cannot even imagine how they come, because maybe I grew up in Japan, but other Caucasian people, they have a different idea to using the Japanese ingredient. So sometimes surprise me good way, sometimes really, oh my gosh, I never, for example, in Japan, we don't eat with unagi and the umeboshi together. My grandmother would say, you're gonna have stomachache that you eat the unagi and the umeboshi. But I feel like, the chef, not the Japanese chef, know the ingredient, but they don't know the kind of story. They might do something like this. So sometimes I'm not afraid, but oh no, you never do that this way. But other way, oh, this is a good way to use. Even like you say, Mr. Putting a little kombu on top of the appetizer. If this appetizer is a warm appetizer, the kombu moving because of the heat.
The katsuobushi.
Katsuobushi. So that's a more visually, it's a customer, wow, it's moving. So this is I think the chef wants to, I think that he wants to do moving the katsuobushi, yeah.
Interesting.
Yep.
In response to the question about decor, I don't know if Niki feels this way, but I think Matsuhisa's restaurants really changed the luxury factor of many Japanese restaurants. I'm thinking of the one in New York City where Matsuhisa and, the famous actor, I forgot his name, and then Drew Pierpoint created a restaurant in Manhattan that it just had a lot of gold, I remember. And not in the way that gold is used at Kikuno in Kyoto, but in a much flashier, gaudier way.
Is it Robert De Niro?
Yeah, Robert De Niro. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, so the style, the serving the food. When the Chef Joy Robuchon starting the restaurant called Atelier Robuchon, he started the Roppongi in Tokyo first, not in the Paris.
That's right.
I don't know why. Maybe he want to see the reaction of the customer. Then soon he opened in Paris. Atelier is a counter, restaurant, like a sushi bar. The customer can sit in the counter, and then the chef, the Indian chef will serve to the customer like a sushi counter. So when I was in France, maybe 35 years ago, the chef, French chef, they are responsible in working in the kitchen. Make sure that all the food go out perfectly from the kitchen. They are in charge. But once Joy Robuchon start work, making the atelier style, the counter style restaurant, everybody was shocked. Oh my gosh, why he does those kind of things? French serving style gonna be changed. But he used to go to a lot of sushi bar or restaurant, and he liked the customer to see reaction once the food come out in front of the customer, and then he can see it. But in France, traditionally, the chef never see the reaction of the chef. Only the chef knows when the dish come back to the kitchen. They check if everything is clean. Okay, the customer is happy. If something can come back to the kitchen, he think, why this customer didn't finish it? And he asked the manager, all questions. So he was very happy to change to the style of the serving the French food. I believe in maybe 50 years, lot of the France, the restaurant, they do those kinds of style. Somebody had to start, and he was one to do it.
Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, I'm learning so much throughout this as well. I would be curious, we have a lot of questions asking about I think this balance between the more like fine dining versus mom and pop shops. But someone from the Denver Takayama Sister City Committee asked Chef Niki and Chef Akira, as Japanese food has become hot stuff, how do you go for where do you go for the typical Japanese fare for people who can't afford an expensive kaiseki meal? And then a question from Linda, which I think is interesting for you all at Azay, is saying that I love the chawanmushi our mom used to make. Why is it not offered very often in restaurants? Because I know that you all do offer it, right? So, yeah, those are the two questions. So wondering what you all eat for your foods.
I think for us, we end up eating at home a lot because it's just a lot easier to be able to cook and eat what we want to eat. But that said, there are a wonderful array of, Japanese restaurants in our city in Los Angeles, especially. I think LA is probably one of the best cities for Japanese food amongst all other ethnic cuisines. And I highly just recommend everybody just supporting their local neighborhoods. And I'm sure there's going to be an incredible thing that they'll discover. And for chawanmushi, I find that it's a funny thing. Like, people really either really love it, or they're if they're not familiar with it, they might find it strange texture-wise. That's what I've discovered, that for people who aren't accustomed to eating chawanmushi, that the texture might be a little strange because it's usually in context of a sweet dessert and not a savory one.
But that chawanmushi made with the dashi and the eggs. That I talked about the tamago gohan. I love eggs, so I love chawanmushi. And then I remember when I was making the chawanmushi in the Pasadena, my parents came to visit the restaurant, and my dad ate my chawanmushi. I passed. He said, "This one good. You can continue to serve." So he used to go to a lot of restaurants in Kyoto, so he knows that he has a good taste. And but he ate everything from any casual restaurant to the high-end restaurant. But he loved chawanmushi, and I like chawanmushi. And then, as a French, I like a caramel flan, which is caramel pudding. I love them too. Texture is very important, but of course, taste. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I think you touched on this, but from Matthew, we had a question for both chefs again, but about who inspires you and what do you cook at home? I think that's something that people are always curious about, what do these chefs cook at home? And then also, thank you so much for feeding us. We love our cuisine, is what he said.
Niki will give you the honors to go first.
I think, Niki, did you have?
Oh, okay. Questions? So at home on the weekends, we always do shabu shabu or hot pot. It's always like on the menu at least once a week. And it's my favorite thing to do because all we have to do is just cut vegetables and throw it all in the pot. And the best part of it is I think it's such a multi-layer dining experience because first you eat the meat and the vegetables in the pot, and then we always finish with zosui or some type of rice risotto. And I think it's super comforting and so easy to prepare. So that's what I eat at home all the time.
Yeah, at home, not consistently I make, or at home is mostly my wife making. Nabe. Yeah, nabe, she make it, and then, very good, very flavorful. And then myself, if I make it, I'm not really difficult. If I see some good tsukemono, miso shiru, and gohan, I'm happy.
Yeah,
I don't make that much. She make all the time.
Yeah, thank you. A few more questions. We're coming up on time, but we have so many good questions. I'm curious kind of to all of you, because something about this whole series is we've been talking really about the relationship between Japan and the US and how food has changed in coming to the US. And you talked about kind of pre and post war, but someone asked, is there any single dish that you might identify as Japanese American, i.e. not Japanese or American, but exclusively a Nikkei designated food item here? This could be to anyone, like maybe subi, California roll, which a lot of folks say has an origin in Little Tokyo.
Chicken teriyaki or salmon teriyaki. Because in Japan, I don't see the name of the teriyaki name. Teriyaki is the word when we're cooking. You make it like a teri and teriyaki, but not gonna be on the menu.
Yeah.
But teriyaki, salmon teriyaki, chicken teriyaki in the menu. So yeah.
Nisei.
That's true.
Nisei you can start, I think.
Yeah. I don't know if people feel this way about musubi, but I think omusubi and onigiri are just so important. Were important for me when I was growing up. Was it that way for people on the mainland as well? I mean, my mother would on weekends make musubi and we'd take a picnic.
Mm-hmm.
When we go to the picnic or a school trip, we call it omusubi, not the onigiri.
Yeah.
And the omusubi, you might know the name the omusubi from the history of the Momotaro. Yeah, Momotaro. Momotaro given to the omusubi to the dog, the kerai, dog and the pheasant and the monkey. He give to the omusubi if you come with me to help to the beat the omusubi. They don't say onigiri.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that. I don't know. Do people still make omusubi when they travel? When you take trips, you make
I believe onigiri is forever going to be a part of Japanese life and daily Japanese life, especially because a lot of onigiri comes from leftover rice that is just seasoned, and it's that feeling of mottainai, how Japanese people just like to continue using something until it ends. And I think rice is such a big part of Japanese culture and Japanese lifestyle that it'll forever be a part of our daily lives.
And it's interesting that onigiri and omusubi have become very popular in the US, haven't they?
Yes, they have become very popular. I think people are just enjoying how it travels. I think the travel and how satisfying it is sometimes when you're just hungry, and even though there's just a little bit of salt on that rice and a nice piece of nori, it's incredibly satisfying.
Yeah, I would love also, I don't know if you wanted to talk about, I think, your new project with the ekiben and the location specific meals and having the influence from a place. I'm really interested about that project that you're doing right now.
Right, so we started to do this project called the Ekiben Collaboration Series, and basically it's born out of this COVID times, and what we really want to do is, you know, collaborate with people in different areas to sort of put together a story of working together in order to raise money to help and support local communities and things that people believe in. But what we're really excited about right now is we're doing an ekiben that's focused on Japanese real ekiben. And it's been really fun to sort of gather all these little different ingredients from different areas of Japan to tell the story of it. And we're using a beautiful Ibaraki rice. But our next ekiben is going to be a Japanese American specific ekiben. And I think what's so interesting and exciting about this is, you know, prior to thinking about this, I never thought about what Japanese American food is or was. And it was just kind of like, oh, well, that's what we ate when we go to the restaurants. Just as Chef Akira said that, you know, teriyaki. It's like growing up, I never thought that it wasn't Japanese until I actually went to Japan, and there's like no chicken teriyaki anywhere. There's no salmon teriyaki anywhere. You just sort of, you know, it's like a teriyaki is a style, but it's not a dish. And I think what's so interesting and exciting for us to learn about is how after Japanese people left Japan and came to America and using this limited resource of ingredients, how were they able to find some semblance of home, and how they, you know, changed in order to make this new home part of home, but combining cultures together. And I think that's such an interesting way, because I think food has that magical bridge that can tell stories that, unlike other things, it's something that's embedded in memory and something that's embedded by like flavor profiles. And it's such a wonderful way to define identity. And I think we're really excited to sort of use the ekiben collaboration to not just tell Japanese stories, but to tell people of different cultures and their stories. So we hope you give it a try.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's, I think you really concluded all of the the reason why we're doing this series and why we invited all of you, because of this reason. And love how you're giving back with these meals as well. And I think Azay and Little Tokyo has been so invested in community as well. So both of your restaurants are just so important, and really grateful that you're here. We are at time, so I could talk forever, but want to shoot one question over to Sam Nakahira. Someone said, I really appreciate about how graphic novels help history come alive, and I'm looking forward to reading yours. Are you planning on doing more graphic novels to showcase Japanese Americans and their achievements in history, or have any other projects with the farm to table or any other resources we should look out for as we wrap this up?
Yeah, so I've been mostly doing short comics since working on Bill Fujimoto's comic. But I do hope to be making more graphic novel length comics about Japanese Americans. And yeah, I'm still interested in learning more about food history, I think. So maybe in the future there'll be something similar or related.
Nice.
Well, we're looking forward to that. And if folks want to check out the graphic novel, it is available now in the JANM store. So definitely go and look at that. You can find the link in the chat here today. And so just to conclude us out, I want to just ask the question that someone asked of what is the future of Japanese cuisine in America? Or what is your hope for the future of Japanese cuisine in America? Maybe we can go around with a short response from each of us. Someone want to kick us off?
I think my hope for the future of Japanese food in America is, while I love seeing many chefs experiment and learn about Japanese cuisine, I really hope that there's a deeper understanding to what Japanese cuisine is about. Because it's one thing to put furikake on your onigiri, but it's another thing to put furikake on everything. And it's this understanding of where everything comes from and a deeper delve into it is really important as a way to respect other people's cultures. So I hope that people who love Japanese cuisine really take the time to understand it on a deeper level.
Japanese cuisine, the future in the here in the United States, I believe going to more close to the Japanese cuisine, which is from maybe 10, 15, 20 years, the sushi became so popular and it's still going on. And now the people looking for the more casual Japanese cuisine. My wife says omiyaki or udon, yakisoba, those kind of casual comfort food. And then more they eat, they want to know what's the real Japanese. In Japan, they're eating. And the healthy food, it's very healthy in Japanese food. And the more technology, more Japanese people coming to teaching here, or other way, they go into Japan to study some restaurant, and they bring back their what they study. So I believe more going to cross the Japanese cuisine.
I think he said yes.
Yeah, I worry about the top and expensive Japanese restaurants. Will they survive in the US and in Europe and in China? But the other thing that will happen, I think sushi will become more and more sustainable. And I think that sushi as we know it now will probably cease to exist after 2030, which will be very sad. But as Akira knows, in Kyoto, there's vegetable osushi and tsukemono osushi, things like that, which Americans don't know much about. But the other thing that we haven't talked about at all is how Japanese cuisine has entered and insinuated itself into popular youth culture. And so ramen is a really important part of youth culture. And of course, that's a whole nother subject. And I think that dimension will continue to evolve as top ramen restaurants open branches in the US and Europe. Ippudo and even Sta has a branch in San Francisco. I mean, who had ever heard of Michelin-starred ramen restaurants? So I think there'll be development in that area, dramatic development.
Yeah, thank you. Kristen or Sam, any final thoughts? I know.
I don't know if I'm the right person to make predictions about the future of Japanese food, but I think one point that came up today was just, looking at this treasure trove of menus, and hopefully if our collection can maybe inspire chefs today to sort of recreate some of these, older traditional recipes, then I think that would be really cool. So.
Well, with that, Sam, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm the most qualified to answer this either. But I really like, I also think kind of similar to what Sam said, that Japanese food is really becoming popular amongst youth in America. I think it seems very easy for non-Japanese people to kind of know ramen and katsu and just sushi in general, which is very interesting. But I also agree with Niki about people should try to kind of understand the history of the cuisine and not treat it as kind of as a trend or something with a shallow understanding. Although I think that it'll continue to be really popular and not just a trend because it's just so good.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's kind of all our hope, is that we continue to be able to engage with these histories, continue to be able to just learn more and honor the roots of all of this. And thank you so much to the work that all of you do to make that possible. I'm really grateful and really honored to be in this space today. As we conclude, yes, just another thank you to the Consulate General of Japan in Los Angeles for their program support. This is part 3 of the food programming, but we have another program with the Consulate General coming up around Japanese businesses and Japanese corporations operations in the in Japanese American communities here in the U.S. So you can find more of that on the website. And this program is being recorded, so it'll be available on YouTube afterwards. So thank you so much. Thank you to you all and everyone in the audience. I hope you have a really safe and wonderful afternoon and get to enjoy some food safely. Please go visit Inaka and Azay and check out Professor Yamashita's and Sam Nakahira's work as well. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a really great night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.